Welcome, everyone. I think we'll get started because there's some just regular logistics to go through. How many of you are getting LSP or other certificates? You know you have to check in at the end of the day or you won't get it. They really want to make sure you're really here for the whole day. So don't forget to do that. And we also just need to know that everyone needs to use the microphone when they're talking. I have no idea how many people are on. Well, actually, I see like 6 participants. So there are people who are listening into the session who aren't in the room. So if you can make sure you use the mic, we'll have a handheld mic to walk around with questions at the end. And we are going to, as we've been instructed, go through all 3 presentations and then take questions at the end. So this is hope you're all still feeling vibrant. This is a great session. And I see a lot of people eating snacks. So do you know if there are PFAS in the snack wrappers? Maybe by the end, you'll have a better idea. So this is a really important topic and a really hot topic about where we're finding PFAS in products and especially in food packaging and other diverse products, I think. So it'd be a great one. And we have 3 speakers. We have Dr. Laurel Schaider, who's going to start us off. She's a senior scientist in environmental chemistry and engineering at Silent Spring Institute. And her research focuses on characterizing PFAS exposures from drinking water, diet, and consumer products, understanding health effects associated with PFAS, and investigating socioeconomic disparities and working with impacted communities to develop research studies and resources. Dr. Schaider is the PI for the PFAS REACH study and also leads the Massachusetts PFAS in Your Health study, and also is involved in that STEEP Superfund research program that Reinder mentioned this morning. So thank you very much for coming, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for sticking around and coming to hear about PFAS in food packaging. I'm going to be talking about implications for exposure and life cycle considerations. So a quick overview for my presentation. I'm going to be talking about the uses and prevalence of PFAS in food packaging. So maybe we'll get a better answer to Liz's question about what types of products frequently contain PFAS. Talk about what we know about PFAS as a potential source of exposure. Think about the broader life cycle implications of PFAS being widely present in food packaging, and share some updates about recent regulatory and retailer action on PFAS in packaging. So first, I wanted to talk a little bit about Silent Spring Institute. For those of you who may not be familiar with our work, we're a nonprofit independent research organization focused on understanding links between everyday chemical exposures and health, with a particular focus on women's health and breast cancer prevention. I've been at Silent Spring since 2009. A lot of my work has focused on PFAS and other emerging contaminants in drinking water, but my work has also extended to consider PFAS in food packaging, PFAS exposures from diet and consumer products. So PFAS are widely used in food packaging. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration has approved certain PFAS for food contact materials. So in addition to paper and paperboard food packaging, this also covers nonstick cookware, gaskets and O-rings and other parts of food processing equipment, as well as certain processing aids for other types of polymers as well. The first fluorochemical application for paper food packaging was approved in 1967 by the FDA. This is a long chain PFAS additive. And PFAS are added to food packaging to confer grease, oil, and water resistance. And I'm sure after a day full of PFAS talks, you're very aware that PFAS are highly stable, even at high temperatures. So FDA has taken some steps along the way to restrict or regulate the types of PFAS that are approved for use in food packaging. In 2011, FDA initiated a voluntary phase out of long chain PFAS from food packaging. And in 2016, they sort of made that official by officially rescinding approval for 3 types of long chain PFAS used in food packaging. Currently, there are around 50 fluorochemicals that are approved by FDA to be marketed in the US, and these are more of the short chain compounds. So where do we typically find PFAS in packaging? Well, one type of packaging that's been pretty consistently associated with PFAS are microwave popcorn bags. This was a study by the Center for Environmental Health in 2017. They tested 27 different types of microwave popcorn bags, and every single one of them contained PFAS. In 2017, I led a study on PFAS in fast food packaging. We collaborated with Environmental Working Group, Green Science Policy Institute, scientists from EPA, and Graham Peasley from who's now at University of Notre Dame. So we tested over 400 samples of fast food packaging from chains all across the country. The sampling took place in 2014, 2015. And we found that nearly half of the paper wrappers that we tested, so picture the kind of wax papery wrappers you use for sandwiches or those little cookie pouches, nearly half of those contain PFAS, and about 20% of paper board samples. I don't know where's a good place to put my little Zoom icon here. It's kind of blocking part of this. And these samples were all screened using PIGGY, so particle-induced gamma emission spectroscopy. It's a rapid screening technique to measure total fluorine. Paper by itself doesn't typically have much fluorine, so where we see detectable fluorine with this method, it's a strong indication of the presence of PFAS. A subset of our samples were also analyzed using liquid chromatography, high-res mass spec methods to look for targeted analytes and non-targeted analytes. We found 27 different PFAS compounds, as well as some unidentified polyfluorinated compounds as well. So these included perfluorocarboxylates and sulfonates, fluorotelomere sulfonates, dipaps, and polyfluorinated polyethers. Interestingly, PFOA was among the specific compounds that we detected most frequently, even though we wouldn't really expect long-chain PFAS to be added to food packaging in 2014 and 2015. Our study didn't include molded fiber packaging, but this is another type of packaging that's frequently been found to contain PFAS as well. You might not be familiar with this phrase, molded fiber packaging, but you've probably seen it if you've gone to Chipotle and gotten a salad bowl or Sweet Green. It looks very eco-friendly. It's usually made from sugarcane or some other sustainable fibers. It's intended for composting, and it seems like a very good idea. Well, there's a lot of interest now in zero waste and thinking about compostability and kind of closing the loop on food waste. Unfortunately, and this is changing, but typically this type of packaging often has PFAS added to make your salad dressing or mac and cheese grease not seep through that packaging. So in 2019, there was some testing done by an online news outlet called The Counter. It used to be the New Food Economy. And they tested compostable bowls from 14 different New York City restaurants, including Chipotle and Sweet Green, and all of them came back with PFAS. To their credit, these brands and others after this article came out made a pledge to stop using PFAS-containing food packaging. A 2019 report by Toxic Free Future and Safer Chemicals Healthy Families tested a number of different types of grocery store samples as well. Fortunately, many of the samples did not seem to contain PFAS. The ones that did were often either these molded fiber packaging samples or paper wrappers for sandwiches and baked goods. It's a good thing that I don't tend to make my slides for talks well ahead of time because things keep changing. So 2 weeks ago, Consumer Reports issued this major study. It was actually pretty similar to our 2017 study. They tested samples of restaurant and grocery store packaging from all across the country for organofluorine, again, as kind of a marker of the presence of PFAS. They found that 31% of their samples exceeded a Danish guideline of 20 parts per million of fluorine. And again, PFOA showed up as one of the most frequently detected compounds. And the types of samples that that had the highest levels of organofluorine, again, were these kind of papery wrappers and the molded fiber trays. Some of these samples even were found in brands that had previously made a pledge to phase out the use of PFAS. Again, I think the timing of this report was timed to coincide with an announcement from Burger King and some other chains as well. And they've also pledged to stop using food packaging that contains PFAS. So one of the gratifying things about our fast food packaging study was that it ended up in The Onion, maybe my highlight of my career, I don't know. But that kind of gets to this question of like, okay, so the PFAS are in the packaging, but like we don't need the packaging. So, you know, how much should we really worry about this? So what are the implications for exposure? So what we do know is that PFAS can migrate out of packaging, and there are some factors that influence the extent of migration. So PFAS tend to migrate more readily out of packaging and into food at higher temperatures if there's longer contact time. Foods with emulsifiers, so these prevent oil and water from separating in products, and at lower pH or more acidic conditions. If you're talking about microwave popcorn, there's also been evidence to show that the PFAS can migrate into the popcorn, and some of those PFAS are actually volatile. So you can actually breathe them in and inhale them. And certain PFAS precursors, after being inhaled, can be converted in your body to things like the very stable perfluorocarboxylates and sulfonates. And if you say, well, how much is this specific PFAS chemical going to migrate out of the packaging? Just like everything with PFAS, the answer is, well, it depends which specific chemical that you're talking about, because each one has slightly different chemical properties. This was a study by Yuan et al. In 2016. They looked at eco-friendly packaging samples, both from the US and from China. They found, not surprisingly, that samples from the US were more likely to contain short-chain PFAS compounds, whereas in China, the profile was more predominantly long-chain PFAS. And we know that long-chain PFAS are still manufactured in China. And they also did some leaching experiments to look at the extent of leaching out of paper bowls and some of the other packaging. We took their data and made a little bar graph here. So going from left to right, we're looking at the perfluorocarboxylates going from C4 to C12. Can't see the 12, but and what you see is that the short chain are much more likely to migrate out of the packaging than the long chain. This is kind of consistent with what we know about short chains just being more mobile in general. So there's also been a number of studies in terms of trying to make the link between, can we make an association between what people eat and the levels of PFAS in their bodies? And so Silent Spring Institute led a study of NHANES data. So NHANES is a national biomonitoring program led by the CDC. People in the NHANES study answer questions about their diet and all different facets of their life. And they provide blood and urine samples that get tested for PFAS and other chemicals of concern. And that data is all publicly available. So we analyzed data from NHANES from 2003 to 2014. And we found that consumption of microwave popcorn was linked to higher blood levels of certain long chain PFAS. So PFOA, PFOS, PFNA, and PFDA. And the most notable trend that we saw was that people who reported eating microwave popcorn daily tended to have 63% higher levels of PFDA. This is the C10 compound. So microwave popcorn is like a pretty specific food, and microwave popcorn bags have pretty consistently linked to having PFAS in them. If we look a little more broadly, like, well, do people who eat more fast food tend to have higher PFAS levels? It's a little more complicated because that refers to a lot of different types of packaging, a lot of different types of foods. But we did, with the NHANES data, we were also able to see a trend that people who reported eating more meals at home tended to have lower levels of PFAS in their blood. And there's two possible explanations, and probably they both contribute to this trend. One is that restaurant food could have more contact with packaging that's likely to contain PFAS. Again, from that study that looked at grocery store packaging, the type of packaging seems less likely to contain PFAS. It's also possible, and we couldn't really distinguish the two, it's possible that people, when they go out, maybe they eat more fish or they eat more meat, and so there's something different about the types of food that they're eating when they're out. But it at least provides some evidence that consumption of fast food and other restaurant food can lead to elevated PFAS levels. I'm going to skip that one in the interest of time. So then another Silent Springs study looked at the CHDS, the Child Health and Development Study in California. This was a cohort of white and African-American women in California. Similar to NHANES, it's much smaller, but it also included a questionnaire as well as blood measurements of PFAS. And in this study, we also found that reporting more consumption of food prepared in cardboard packaging, so things like pizza or French fries, was associated with higher levels of 4 long-chain PFAS. We only saw that trend for the African-American women in the study. A little beyond the scope for this sessions for my talk specifically, but higher levels of PFAS in blood were also associated with living in a water district that had detectable PFAS in the UCMR testing from 2013 to 2015, having stain-resistant carpets or furniture in your house, and flossing with Oral-B Glide dental floss. And there have been some other studies as well, especially with the microwave popcorn, suggesting links between people who eat more microwave popcorn and more snacks and higher PFAS levels in their bodies. But there haven't really been a lot of other studies that have looked more specifically at fast food packaging or restaurant food and the extent to which that increases population level exposure. But I think on the whole, the evidence points to food packaging being one potentially important source of exposure to PFAS in the general population. So I wanted to think a little bit about the life cycle implications for PFAS in food packaging. So beyond just that time when you have your burger or your cookie in your hands and you're thinking about, is this going to actually increase how much PFAS ends up in my body? What are sort of the broader implications of having PFAS in food packaging? Again, at the end of a full day of PFAS talks, you've probably heard about the essential uses framework. So the idea is where PFAS serving a really critical function right now, protecting health and safety, where we don't have a good alternative. And maybe we reserve PFAS just for those types of applications. And where are they really not essential? Where do they not provide a health or safety function? Or where do we have a good substitution available? And so this 2019 paper that laid out the essential use framework specifically called out food packaging and said non-fluorinated alternatives have historically been available for all applications of paper and board food packaging, and the use of fluorinated protective coatings has never been essential. If we think a little bit more broadly in terms of why we want to think about the life cycle of PFAS in food packaging, certainly we can think about where PFAS are manufactured and the impacts on the communities and the workers in those locations. But then beyond the very short life that the packaging is useful for us, the PFAS in those products have a much longer life after we're finished using that product. And so when you throw away a food wrapper, that can go to a landfill, and those PFAS can leach into groundwater or end up going to a wastewater treatment plant if that's where the leachate is treated. And again, with more interest in compostability and sustainability, there's the potential that the compostable food packaging ends up with the food being composted, food breaks down, it's a good use of nutrients to be land applied, but we don't want to be adding these highly persistent chemicals that won't break down and have the potential to be taken up into plants that we eat or end up in water supplies. And so the Biodegradable Products Institute, this is an organization that certifies products as compostable, has incorporated concerns about PFAS in their certification process. So in 2020, they updated their standard and said that products can no longer be claimed as BPI certified if they have intentionally added fluorinated chemicals or if they have over 100 parts per million of fluorine. So I wanted to wrap up here by providing some updates about the regulatory landscape, both at the state level and at the federal level, and also to talk about some actions that retailers have taken in recent years. So as with drinking water, there's actually been a lot of action with respect to restrictions on PFAS and food packaging coming at the state level. So there are currently 7 states that have enacted bans. Not all of them have fully gone into effect, but they're on the books in 7 states to ban PFAS as a class in food packaging. And other states have proposed legislation that's currently being considered, including here in Massachusetts. And if this is something that you want to try to keep on top of, the Safer States website is a great resource, not just for food packaging, but for tracking policies for other consumer items as well. As a researcher, it's often hard to see the direct impact of the work that we do, but it was really gratifying to me personally to see that when the New York State legislature drafted their ban on PFAS in food packaging, they did specifically call out our 2017 fast food packaging study as one of the motivations for their legislation. In response to the discovery of PFAS in food packaging, a number of retailers have committed to eliminating PFAS. I mentioned some of the examples before, such as Chipotle and Sweetgreen, that have previously made these commitments. Again, just 2 weeks ago, after that consumer report study or report came out, Chick-fil-A, Burger King, and Starbucks and other brands have also announced that they're going to switch to PFAS-free packaging. There's also been some recent FDA action as well. Typically, there's kind of been a distinction with respect to how the FDA has been approving PFAS for food packaging. They had as I mentioned, they had a voluntary phase out of long chain PFAS, but short chain PFAS were still considered acceptable. There's been new evidence in the past couple of years, actually by toxicologists at FDA, showing that some of the short chain PFAS are actually more toxic and more biopersistent than previously thought. Specifically the 6,2-fluorotellumer alcohol, which over time can convert into the more stable PFHXA, but the precursor itself and one of its metabolites raised new concerns about persistence and toxicity, and actually seemed to be just as toxic as some of the long chain PFAS that they weren't allowing to be in packaging. So in July 2020, FDA announced a voluntary agreement with 3 manufacturers to phase out products containing the 6,2-fluorotellumer alcohol chemistry. And then this is kind of like a new space that I'm just trying to learn about and stay on top of. So there was a year or two ago, a discovery that certain pesticides that were being sprayed widely for mosquito control contain PFAS. This was discovered by the group Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. They shared the results with EPA, and EPA did some follow-up testing and figured out that the PFAS actually seemed to be coming from the bottles that the pesticides were being stored in. And it was revealed that it was a process of fluorinating the plastics, I guess, to make them more stable, that was leading to the creation of PFAS in these polyethylene bottles. And so I'm actually not totally sure how much this impacts food packaging specifically, but I do know that in August of 2020, FDA issued new guidance on fluorinated polyethylene, certain conditions that are not permitted to minimize the production of PFAS, and other types of plastics where fluorination is not being permitted. Great, I'm on my last slide. Good timing. So I just wanted to end with some challenges and put out some ideas. Maybe this can some of these we can discuss during the Q&A session. So it's really great to see, in my opinion, a lot of action and a lot of steps taken to eliminate or reduce the use of PFAS in food packaging, which is clearly an example of non-essential use of PFAS. But this raises some questions in terms of how are you going to regulate enforce these regulations? What if you're a retailer and you want to verify that there's no intentionally added PFAS in your products? Some of this comes down to analytical methods. In some of the previous sessions, we've heard about total fluorine or total organofluorine as a way to screen for PFAS as a class. In our fast food packaging study, we found that most of the PFAS in the wrappers were not present in a form that could be extracted and that we could measure in targeted or non-targeted analysis. So there's a lot of PFAS in the packaging that we can't necessarily see. I'd say another issue that has come up a lot is the how to distinguish between intentional and non-intentional uses. So PFAS are sort of everywhere. So if you're making paper products, if you're incorporating any recycled paper, that could bring in PFAS, or there could be PFAS in the equipment used to make the paper, even if you're not intentionally adding PFAS to impart grease or water resistance. And there's been some discussion about what's that cutoff, how can we distinguish at what level PFAS are being intentionally added? And the Danish Veterinary and Food Administration actually introduced an indicator value of around 20 micrograms per gram or parts per million of organofluorine in paper as a guide for what's a level indicative of intentionally added PFAS. And I hope you were in the last session where our moderator gave a talk about avoiding regrettable substitutions and how do we know that the alternatives that we're using are safer. So with that, thanks for your attention. I look forward to our discussion later.
Thank you, Laurel. That was great. I'm going to start yours and I'll yeah, I was just going to introduce you if you could put it in slideshow mode while we do this together. Next speaker is Usha Vedagiri. And she's a principal risk assessor with Wood Consultant. She's been involved with PFAS issues since 2012 and has evaluated PFAS both from product assessment and the environmental release perspectives. She's an active member of the ITRC PFAS team. How many people take advantage of ITRC resources? Yeah, they're great. So thank you for that. And assist clients with evaluating PFAS liabilities in relation to products, supply chains, and environmental issues.
So I don't see the.
It's a very touchy pad here, isn't it? Get this out of the way.
Oh, it was hiding it. Okay.
Whoops. It's very touchy. Let's see how that goes.
Okay. Thank you. So I feel this is a really weird circumstance where I feel my presentation really picks up where you left off. The positioning is really great because what I'm here to talk about today is not so much about how much PFAS do we find in different kinds of products, but really to focus more on an overview of one of the tools that we use to try to avoid or minimize PFAS content in the products that we use, and that is these certifications and labels that are out there. My co-authors are Sean Gormley and Dean Lay, both from Wood, and they're not here today, unfortunately. And the reason this question came up in our minds was because we were assisting some clients with supply chain vulnerability issues related to PFAS and alternatives assessments. And so we were looking at the certifications that go along with a lot of the products and supplies that the client was purchasing in order to use in their own manufacturing process and ultimately their products. And we realized that there's a lot more to these certifications than just PFAS free. You really need to understand the assumptions that go into each of these certifications. And so then we figured, well, this is worth sharing with others. So like Laurel was just saying, you know, there are two ways in which we see bans related to PFAS in products. One is mandatory bans, the ones that are enacted by regulatory agencies. Typically, the most common categories of products for which we see the bans are food packaging, carpeting, upholstery, building supplies, fabrics, cosmetics, and some states have juvenile products too. And then there's voluntary phase outs that many big name manufacturers and retailers have announced. And they all sound good, but again, it's really useful to pay attention to the fine print. So Target, for example, and Home Depot, when they talked about that we're going to get PFAS out of our carpets and rugs, it was for indoor carpets and rugs. It was not necessarily for outdoor. And so if you don't pay attention, it's not like there's good guys and bad guys. It's just that in order to be an intelligent consumer, you have to know what you're buying. So as I go through, there are some key concepts to remember when it comes to product concepts, and we're seeing these labels and certifications. It's important to think about what compounds are they covering? Are they saying one individual PFAS compound is being eliminated, or are they talking about a whole class or all PFAS? Also, why was it there in the first place? Is it intentionally added or unintentional? And where is it? Like if you're in California and you're used to Prop 65, you know, there is a difference between whether the PFAS might be in a portion of the product where a consumer could come into contact with it, or if it is sealed in a way that you cannot have direct exposure to it. So those are things that go into understanding product-related certification concepts. And then when it comes to the certification itself, there are a lot of institutions out there that have different kinds of certifications. They could be public entities like EPA, or they could be private entities. They could be using the honor system where they don't do independent verification of whether or not PFAS is present in a product, or maybe they do some verification. Is it static or is it updated, as in the sense that, PFAS is such a moving target, the field is evolving so fast. And so do you certify it once and then you're good forever? Or is it the kind of certifying institution that keeps checking for how to keep it up to date? And finally, analyte suite, again, is an important thing because, first it was 10 compounds, 20 compounds, now we're talking thousands of compounds. So again, what do we mean when we say PFAS free? So some of the most common product labels you might have seen would be PFOS free, P4 free, you will often see on cookware. PFAS free, we see that, no added PFAS, fluorine free, these are all labels that are out there. There is probably more. And when we were doing our study for one of our clients, what we did was we took labels like these and we did the usual, review all the SDS that they use to see whether there's PFAS listed in those SDS. Well, that was not always enough. Sometimes it never said whether there was PFAS in there or not, but there were older SDS. So they were not required to report it maybe. So then we did email outreach to the vendors and the manufacturers, asking them if there was PFAS in their products. Sometimes they would answer, sometimes they wouldn't, or even if they did answer, it might be very incomplete information or they truly didn't know. Then we made phone calls to them, to individuals, to ask them, for the information. Sometimes they answered, but still mostly it was incomplete information. There were a few really smart manufacturers, I would say, who did have the information, but most of them didn't, or they were not willing to share. And then regardless of what information we got from them, we also tried to do our own independent desktop research to see whether for that category of products, whether it is lube oils or grease or consumer products, whatever it is, whether we could find any confirmation of whether PFAS could be in there or not. And finally, the gold standard was lab analysis. Like if it is important enough to know for your purpose whether or not PFAS is present, then there's nothing like just doing your own lab analysis. And we did submit some samples for lab analysis that were supposed to be PFAS free. And we found differences from one batch to the next from the same manufacturer. Sometimes they reported at very low levels, or they report 3 PFAS in one batch, and then the next batch, those 3 would not be there, but something else would be there. And so it was really helpful to do those lab analyses to understand for yourself what the reality was. So some of the certifications, this table has 3 columns, and in the first column, what I'm showing is some of the most common certifying institutions. EPA and FDA shown in black, they're regulatory institutions. All the other ones shown in blue are NGOs. And really, if you look at the second column, it shows the products that they are certifying or labeling in some way, and it actually includes a lot of different categories, all kinds of industrial products. It's not just about consumer products. But the most important thing is when you look at the third column, the criteria, there's like 3 main things that really jump out. First, there's really nobody that says 0 PFAS in all cases. There's some exceptions are allowed, there's some authorized limited use, or there's some numeric, 1 ppm total organic fluorine or something like that that's allowed. The second thing is that really most of them do not do their own verification, except for BPI, which requires that the manufacturers submit their samples to a lab that's approved by BPI. The others, they don't really lay out how they do the verification. And in fact, PFAS Central uses an honor system. They just list any company whose corporate policy commits to being PFAS free as a preferred source. And again, there's no good guys or bad guys here. It's just everybody is trying to make difficult decisions on a difficult topic. But these are all different ways that people are trying to use what information is out there to help consumers make some decisions. And the Environmental Working Group, they do reserve the right to perform random testing, but we don't really know what kind of testing they do. And in all cases, whether this is information from the certification programs or the information that we get from the manufacturers, the most difficult information to get, even if they are doing any testing, is what's the analytical method that they're using, which compounds are they testing for, and what are the detection limits. And detection limits is really important when it comes to PFAS, because these numbers are all 100 ppm levels, right? But our water quality standards are parts per trillion. And they can even go below the limits of detection. So how do you know if somebody says they're PFAS free, but you don't know the analytical testing that was used, how far above or below some risk-based screening level they are? There's other eco labels and recommendations. This is from one of EPA's websites. And again, here you see how they cover all different kinds of products, but you can see how many numeric minimum thresholds there are in terms of some allowable limit at which you will still get certified. And for the second bullet, the one that says living product challenge, and Declare 2.0, where it says must not contain PFAS, it does not specify how you would prove must not contain PFAS. Again, in terms of what suite of analytes would you be looking at, what would be the detection limits, that kind of thing. And one of the things that, okay, let me go to this one. There's one more. So for unintentional impurities, EPA and the European Chemicals Agency, they do have some limits. This is for if you're a manufacturer, you're buying products from a vendor, and it's not intentionally added, but it could be there as impurities. They do set some threshold values for what you cannot exceed. And so if you look at something like 100 ppm, reporting limits. So let's say you're a manufacturer, you're buying raw materials and supplies, and you're buying them with these certified labels. And it's okay, you're buying it, it's all good, but you have emissions to the air, you have wastewater effluent from your plant, you are using PFAS-free products, as far as you know, to make your own product. But those air emission standards and your wastewater standards, they're at the level of parts per trillion, parts per quadrillion. You don't know if what you are buying perfectly above board, whether it could leach at levels that will meet those extremely low regulatory and compliance limits. So in terms of what these products and labels mean, PFOA free, PFOS free, it really only means that particular compound was not intentionally included. It doesn't mean that other PFAS could not be there. A lot of times they are there. But it does show an effort to control intentionally added PFAS. And like I said before, typically it's very difficult to get information from the manufacturer on what level of testing and what kind of testing they did. If they did it themselves, did they do a third-party verification? Mostly, we don't know. If it says fluorine-free, then again, it signifies that they're trying to control intentionally added PFAS. It's not just in firefighting foams, even some of the water repellent finishes for textiles say fluorine-free. And again, we typically do not get analytical information on how they would support these claims. If it says Pfas Not Detected, that to me is a really interesting one, because not detected kind of implies that they did do testing, but they typically don't like to share that information. When that speaker from San Francisco DPH was giving her presentation, I noticed that she had the same experience. Either they don't have the information, or they have it, but they don't want to share it with you because they see it as business confidential information. So finally, if you are a vendor, I think it's really important, in order for our own protection as a vendor, what are we promising when we are telling our customers that our products are certified for regarding PFAS in some way? And what do our customers think they're buying versus what we think we are selling to them? And what is our liability? Because they think they're getting something that gets them out of, they don't have to worry about anything. But suppose there's some very low levels that leach into their waste streams, then are they going to come back and hold the vendor liable? Now, if you're a buyer or a consumer, it's really important to think about why you're buying PFAS free. Is it like a personal conviction? Is it product safety? Or a big one, is it environmental concern in terms of releases possibly to your waste streams? You have to understand why you want to know so that you can structure your approach. And so then how much uncertainty can you tolerate, and how much can you afford not to know when you're making the buying decisions? And should you do your own testing? All of that is important. So typically we would recommend a roadmap to our clients or anybody who's interested. Begin with first understanding why you want to go PFAS free. Review all the information out there, really make sure you understand the basis of all these certifications and labels in relation to why you are trying to go PFAS free. Establishing uncertainty limits is really important, because your level of uncertainty that's tolerable would be different based on if you're afraid of getting sued versus you want to green up your image, and then do your own testing if it's needed and select the appropriate products. But don't just stop with that one round. Remember that this is a developing field, and so stay up to date. Make sure maybe this first go around, you only tested for 10 PFAS and they are all coming up non-detect. Well, by next year, people will say 40 PFAS and then 100 PFAS. So got to kind of stay on top of what's going on. And so ultimately, it's really an issue of, we're all in this together. There's really, I really don't see this as a good guy, bad guys kind of issue at all. It's just a difficult situation that is really, it's developing every week or every month. There is something new coming along. And so if we are trying to make decisions on PFAS and products, you have to think about it in this sort of cradle to cradle approach and make the right decisions, and keep thinking of it as an iterative process rather than just do it once and you're done kind of thing. That's it.
Thank you, Usha. That was great. A little disconcerting, but great. Yep, I will bring it up and introduce you, and you can get it ready. How's that? So, by the way, I believe, Usha, you came from California to be here, and Ray Eaton is here from Washington State, and appreciate both of you traveling such a long way. Ray is the Hazard and Alternatives Assessment Specialist in the Hazardous Waste and Toxics Reduction Program at the very progressive Washington State Department of Ecology. Her work identifying, evaluating alternatives to chemicals of concern includes PFAS and supports Washington's progress towards improving safety of consumer products. Ray currently leads the PFAS and Food Packaging Alternatives Assessment Project, which is really great, by the way, which evaluates potential alternatives to PFAS in specific types of food packaging. So she's here to share that with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. I apologize to those on joining us on the internet, but I am going to minimize this so I don't stare at myself talking the entire time. Afternoon, everyone. Hope we're all feeling somewhat awake this late in the day. Hopefully this will be a pretty interesting talk to keep you all engaged. My name again is Ray Eaton. I'm a chemist with the Washington State Department of Ecology. I'm going to pivot slightly and really focus today on more of a case study, focusing on Washington's work, looking less at PFAS and how it's used in food packaging and more looking at alternatives to PFAS in paper-based food packaging. This work was done predominantly by the Washington State Department of Ecology, but we also work really closely in consultation with partners at the Department of Health. And Holly Davies, who I think promised that she wouldn't be in the room for this talk, is also at the conference and has also worked a lot on this project. So just a quick overview of the talk before we get started. I'm going to start with a now very quick introduction into the problem and the bill that was passed by the Washington State Legislature that started this work. Then I'm going to give a brief overview of the process we use to look at alternatives to PFAS in food packaging, and then use that process to talk about the results that we got from our first alternatives assessment. I'm going to conclude very briefly by talking about our more recent work doing a second alternatives assessment, and close by very quickly talking about some work we're trying to do implementing or taking action on the results of these alternatives assessments. So thank you, Dr. Schaider, for that great introduction. This slide is basically obsolete at this point, but I will say here that as I am talking about PFAS in food packaging today, Washington State uses a specific definition for PFAS as a class, which is any chemical that meets the definition of a class of fluorinated organic chemicals containing at least one fully fluorinated carbon atom. So moving on. Back in 2018, the Washington State Legislature passed a law that amended our toxics in packaging law to prohibit the sale or distribution in Washington State of paper food packaging to which PFAS has been intentionally added in any amount. Very clear and straightforward, of course. However, they did add a caveat to this prohibition, which is that before a restriction can take effect for any types of food packaging, the Department of Ecology must first conduct an alternatives assessment that identifies alternatives to PFAS that are safer, perform as well as PFAS, and are readily available and cost comparable. Once we have identified alternatives, or at least one alternative that meets all of those criteria for a type of food packaging, then 2 years later, a prohibition on intentionally added PFAS in that type of food packaging begins. So with all that in mind, the bulk of our work has been on doing these alternatives assessments. So I wanted to give you an introduction into what that is. An alternatives assessment is a process for doing informed substitution that focuses on identifying less hazardous alternatives to chemicals of concern that also are technically have technical performance and are economically feasible alternatives to a chemical of concern. Alternatives assessments as a framework really focus on reducing the risk from hazardous chemicals in products by reducing the hazards of the chemicals by going for less hazardous substitutions rather than trying to reduce the risk of, trying to reduce the exposure of people or the environment to a hazardous chemical. In hazardous waste and toxics reduction, we particularly like to use alternatives assessments and more broadly encourage the adoption of safer alternatives, because from a waste management perspective, it is far better to substitute in a less hazardous alternative before it even goes into a consumer product, rather than having it, be used by people or get into the environment and then need to be treated and disposed of at a later date. So for our law, we were specifically instructed to follow the Interstate Chemical Clearinghouse's Alternatives Assessment Guide, which is a specific method for doing alternatives assessments. It follows 3 rough steps. The first one is to do a scoping phase where you identify what products you're going to focus on and what chemicals you're going to look at. Then you collect information on alternatives and your chemical of concern in the products you're looking at. And then finally, you compare alternatives either to each other or to chemicals of concern. In the first step, the scoping phase, we were of course given our chemical of concern. It's PFAS as a class. So our scope really focused on identifying what types of food packaging we would look at for the assessment and what alternative substances might be used in place of PFAS in those types of food packaging. We then looked at 4 evaluation modules that were taken directly from the IC2 guide that will help us confirm that the alternatives meet the statutory requirement to be less hazardous than PFAS, perform as well or better than PFAS, be readily available and cost comparable, and when needed, and I'll come back to this later, have a similar or lower exposure potential than PFAS. Once we collect data simultaneously on all 4 of those modules for all of the alternatives, we then compare each alternative to PFAS, and we're going to reach one of 3 conclusions in doing that comparison. If the alternative performs as well or better than PFAS in all 4 of those assessment modules, then it meets our statutory definition of a safer alternative, and a prohibition can go into effect. If, however, it does not perform as well as PFAS in one or more of those modules, then it doesn't meet our definition of a safer alternative at this time. Finally, we might run into a situation, and spoiler alert, we ran into this situation where we didn't find enough information to reach a conclusion about an alternative in one of the modules. And so we determined that there's just not enough information to make a decision about that alternative in this assessment. Underlying all of this, and more broadly, most of the work we do at the Department of Ecology is, of course, stakeholder involvement. We followed the IC2 guide here as well to get information from stakeholders through a very structured process that really focused on working with stakeholders like those listed on the side here to get information about any problems or concerns they have in the alternatives assessment, document those problems, and then when appropriate, address them potentially by making changes to our assessment. For our work specifically, we really sought input on things like the project scope, so what types of food packaging we were looking at, the actual methods we were using for the assessment, and also critically information about PFAS or alternative technologies that would inform our assessment. In particular, some of the stakeholders in this list were very crucial to getting the information we needed to do the assessment. As Osha mentioned, a lot of the information that we need is things that companies consider to be proprietary and don't always want to share. So we oftentimes had to work with companies to figure out what information they were comfortable sharing with us that we could use in this evaluation. So for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to primarily focus on our first alternatives assessment, which really focused on these 10 types of food packaging that I'm listing here, which are more or less the types of food packaging you might expect to find PFAS in if you are, in a restaurant or getting fast food or maybe getting things from the grocery store. Once we had identified those 10 types of food packaging, we then identified alternative substances that could potentially be used to replace PFAS. And I'm showing the list of 10 that we focused on for this assessment. This list of 10 can largely be grouped into one of 3 types of alternative. It's a non-chemical alternative, so it's just a different method of making paper. It could be a chemical alternative, such as an alternative coating that you apply to paper or incorporate instead of PFAS. Or it could be an entirely different base material, such as using a biodegradable plastic instead of paper. I'll get to this a little bit more later, but we also did consider what we would consider a system alternative, which instead of using single-use food packaging, we thought about switching to reusable food packaging instead. So with that scope in mind, like I said, we then collected information on alternatives and PFAS across 4 evaluation modules. I'm going to focus on the first 2, hazard and exposure, in the same one because they draw on a lot of the same information. And as you'll see from these tables, for each evaluation module we're working on, there's sort of one key question we're trying to ask for each of the alternatives. So for hazard and exposure, we're trying to collect information about the alternative substances and information about PFAS that we might find in paper food packaging in order to answer the questions, are there any alternative substances that are less hazardous than PFAS? And if we think it might change our overall decision, is there any information about the alternative substances that might indicate they have similar lower or higher exposure potentials compared to PFAS in food packaging? To actually answer this question, we used chemical hazard assessments to identify information about the hazards of alternatives in PFAS. And as needed, we also looked for information about exposure data or physical chemical properties that could inform a comparative exposure evaluation to compare alternatives to PFAS. I want to drill down a little bit more into the hazard evaluation, just because the chemical hazard assessment really was at the heart of the work that we did. So for chemical hazard assessments, we were using tools like Green Screen for Safer Chemicals, which is the example I'm showing here, and I'll talk more about, or similar hazard assessments that build on existing frameworks for identifying and comparing chemicals on the basis of their human or environmental health hazards. This could be things like the globally harmonized standard for classification of chemicals or EPA's safer choice criteria. All of these hazard assessment methods include ways for a trained assessor to collect peer-reviewed data, government reports, or other information that allows them to make determinations about the chemical on the basis of multiple human or environmental health hazard endpoints. And this example from Green Screen is showing things like carcinogenicity or flammability or persistence or bioaccumulation. The assessor will then take the individual scores that are assigned for each of the hazard endpoints shown in this table and come up with an overall score for the chemical. This can range from it being a very hazardous chemical or a chemical of high concern to something that would be considered a safer chemical. There's always also something in place for the assessor to determine that there's not enough information to score the chemical. And so, there are data gaps that prevent it from being evaluated. So we can take this information about chemical hazards for our alternatives and for PFAS that are known to be used in paper-based food packaging and compare them to each other and draw a conclusion about whether any of the alternative substances we have are less hazardous than PFAS, which is what I'm showing in this table here. So as you can see, of the 10 alternatives that we were looking at, 6 of them had information indicating that they are less hazardous alternatives than PFAS. One of them had information indicating it is not less hazardous than PFAS, so there's similar levels of hazard there. And for the remaining 3, which are plastics, we had insufficient information about their hazards to make a determination. We can also talk about the exposure evaluation here, because as I mentioned before, we really only do the exposure evaluation in our alternatives assessment if we think we're going to get information about the comparative exposure potential that would change our overall determination. And in the case of all of these examples, either the alternative was sufficiently low in hazard that we weren't really concerned about it, or we just didn't have enough information or information indicating that it was just as hazardous. And so we determined that additional information about the exposure potentials wouldn't change our overall conclusions. From there, we switched to actually looking for information about the alternatives as they're used in products and comparing them to similar products that contain PFAS. For these modules, we were focusing on the technical performance and the economic viability, which is to say the cost or availability of alternatives. So for the performance, we're really focused on confirming that the alternatives can meet similar performance criteria as food packaging that contains PFAS. Whereas in cost and availability, we're really looking for any evidence that an alternative is either so rare or so cost prohibitive that it can't really be used as a replacement for PFAS. Some of the information that we were looking for here included things like, is the alternative substance used in products that are offered for sale from multiple manufacturers? Do they have technical or performance and promotional information that verifies that they would be used for the same function as a PFAS containing product? And whenever possible, we were also collecting information on the cost of the product in this first assessment so that we could compare it to the cost of PFAS containing products. So if you want to get into the nitty gritty of this report, it's like 150 pages long. I can send you the link. But what I'm going to do today is just give you a very brief, broad overview of what we found in the performance and cost and availability sections. So for the performance evaluation, we worked with stakeholders to try and identify what the real key requirements were for a piece of food packaging that contains PFAS. And they identified that all of these types of food packaging need to be oil and grease resistant, unsurprisingly. And then depending on the type of food packaging, it might also need to be leak resistant. A good example here is bowls. If they can't hold soup, they're not very good bowls. What we generally found is that the alternative products we were looking at were functionally equivalent to PFAS containing food packaging with 2 exceptions. The first one was certain types of PFAS-free molded fiber that we were looking at back in 2020 did not perform very well if they were holding very oily foods. The second one is, of course, polylactic acid plastic. If it's used in place of paper, has limited performance if it gets very hot. So we noted those sort of caveats on the performance as we saw them. Next, in the cost and availability, as I said, we're really looking for information that the alternatives are used in food packaging that's offered by multiple manufacturers, and that the cost is similar to the cost of PFAS-containing products. We did find that there are PFAS-free food packaging products offered for sale in all types of food packaging. So if you don't want to use PFAS, you don't have to. Some of the alternatives that we were looking at, we did find were available in sufficient quantities for certain food packaging types. And similarly, some of those alternatives were also price comparable with similar PFAS containing products we identified. One other thing here, as I said, we did briefly consider a system alternative, which is instead of using single-use food packaging, what if you switch to a reusable system? And we found that for certain types of food packaging, usually the types you would encounter in a sit-down restaurant like plates or bowls, that reusable products were going to be an available cost comparable option for most users. So now that we've gathered all that information in the different evaluation modules, we then had to compare our alternatives to PFAS for each type of food packaging we were looking at. So for example, if we're looking at wraps and liners, we took all 10 alternatives that could be used in wraps and liners, and we compared each alternative to PFAS across the 4 modules. If everything shows up green, that means the alternative performed as well or better than PFAS and everything, and it meets our requirements for a safer alternative. If there's a box in red, that means that it didn't perform as well as PFAS in that module, and so it doesn't meet our definition of a safer alternative at this time. And then finally, if we didn't have enough information to make a determination in one or more of the modules, then we just can't decide whether or not that alternative would meet our criteria at this time. So it, isn't a safer alternative. So this is a big summary slide. So I apologize. I'm just going to do some quick summary on this. But for the 10 types of food packaging that we were looking at in our first assessment, we identified alternatives to PFAS that met all of our criteria in 4 of them. Those were wraps and liners, plates, food boats, and pizza boxes. And the exact alternatives that met all of our criteria are listed in the column on the right. Couple of things that I'll note here really quickly. You'll notice that a lot of this, the other types of food packaging, it wasn't that we knew that the alternatives weren't safe, met our criteria for safer. We didn't have enough information to evaluate them. This is maybe a common theme that you all are picking up on, but with a lot of this stuff, particularly in the hazard, availability, and cost portions, we ran into issues where companies were not willing to share enough information with us for us to be able to complete this assessment. This could range from companies not wanting to share information about chemical hazards, or even sometimes formulation information about what's actually being used in products. But also sometimes companies will just list a bowl for sale, and you don't know what they put in that bowl. So unless the company is willing to tell you, you can't say for certain what type of alternative it's using, and you can't actually use it in your alternatives assessment. One other thing we did notice was that when we did do our cost comparison, that some of the alternatives to PFAS were not cost comparable. However, there's a big asterisk with that because this data was collected in 2020. And as was pointed out in the previous two talks, there's been a lot of movement in this space and a lot of increasing demand for PFAS-free alternatives. And so we expect that as economies of scale start to go into motion and as production scales up, those cost issues are going to be less of an issue moving forward. Okay, so with all that in mind, one part of our statute is that if we do not identify safer alternatives for all of the food packaging types we're looking at, we have to go back and look at the food packaging types where we didn't identify safer alternatives a second time. So we published that first assessment in February of 2021 and pretty much immediately started work on a second assessment. We were focused on two things here. The first one was to collect feedback on the first assessment from our stakeholders and see, are there places where we need to make changes either to our scope of work or our methods that we used in order to make a stronger second alternatives assessment. The second thing we were focused on is all of those data gaps that we identified in the first alternatives assessment and trying to fill those in with new information whenever possible. I was really hoping I would actually be able to share the results of the second assessment with you all today, but we are this close to publishing it, but we're not there yet. So it is currently being finalized, and I'll have a link at the end of my talk where you can go if you would like to read it once it's published. And then really quickly, just to wrap up, alongside of all of the alternatives assessment work we do in the Department of Ecology, we are, of course, thinking about implementation because we identified 4 types of food packaging that had safer alternatives back in February of 2021. You can no longer use products that meet those definitions that have intentionally added PFAS in them as of February of 2023. So we're trying to encourage distributors to honestly take this as an opportunity to move away from PFAS entirely in all types of food packaging. And we're working with some other agency groups that are working on other types of food packaging and other hazards to sort of cross-list that message as much as possible. Alongside with that, a big thing, as I said, that we try to do is encourage users to, again, take this as an opportunity rather than, a burden, and to actually think about the packaging that they're using. And are there more desirable alternatives, such as compostable products or reusable products that they can use? Or could they look at products that have had their chemical hazards evaluated and are truly safer alternatives compared to PFAS and switch to those instead? So with that, we'll be able to answer some questions now, but I did want to put my email and phone up here, as well as the project website in case you have any questions following this talk. Thank you all for your attention.
Sorry. That's all right. Thank you, Ray. That was great. All 3 talks are great. So to say, we had sort of 3 different approaches. One doing independent analytical testing, another doing certifications, and a third doing government's arranged alternatives assessment to show something safer. So really interesting collection of talks, all trying to get to the same result. The first person to get questions in was Laura, who nicely posted them. Well, otherwise I have to go down and look at my computer. So.
Okay, this one was for Laurel. Does the effluent from paper manufacturing facilities give any indication of the types and packages that likely contain PFAS? And if so, is there any leverage to be applied from the wastewater perspective?
I'm mulling it over. Could you say that again? That's a
really,
good question.
if you're making a paper product and you're using a coating on it, chances are it's being done at some kind of a paper facility.
Okay.
And if they're using a coating that contains a PFAS, chances are that's landing in the wastewater effluent at some level.
Mm-hmm.
And can we go upstream to get any indications about what might be used in some of these products and use that as maybe a leverage point in some states where wastewater effluent is going to be managed?
So you mean if we don't know what they're adding to the paper? Yeah, that's a good question. I suppose chemically, you certainly could by looking at the wastewater to see what might be used. They might know, or there might be another way to find out. Without that, I don't know from a regulatory point of view if that would be a hook for kind of enforcement, rather than just sort of measuring what ends up in the product.
Well, it would be public information at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great question. It makes me think of the sort of case in North Carolina. It's not quite the same thing as what you're talking about but with trying to figure out what new PFAS were being manufactured at the DuPont plant, and the chemical manufacturing plant wasn't disclosing that. So with good analytical chemistry and new methods, they looked in the river upstream and downstream. So it sounds like a similar kind of forensic approach could be helpful.
It's very
Question.
expensive, and we would hope we wouldn't have to go there, but
Yeah, I mean, for something like that where someone does know the answer, it's certainly not the most efficient way to necessarily find that out, but it is an interesting approach that could be useful. Thanks.
I had a question for Usha too. How can we encourage and support companies to take the time and effort to do the confirmation needed for ensuring PFAS free, in quotes? And what have you seen as company motivations for following through with this type of commitment?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? The first
Absolutely.
part.
How can we encourage and support companies to take the time and effort to do the confirmation needed to ensure a PFAS-free type of product? We'll put that in quotes because we know what that means. And what have you seen as company motivations for following through on this type of trying to make their products more PFAS-free?
I would say there are two major motivations, and I will answer your second question first. I think fear of liability is a really key driver. And it could be liability not just in terms of the product, but also, so I work with PFAS both on the product side and on the environmental side. And so there is fear of liability if they've been releasing it in their waste stream for a long time, but didn't know it or didn't analyze for it, and then somebody sues them. So, so the fear of liability, I would say it's a key thing where it's not even external pressure. It just makes business sense for them to get that information. I would say the second thing is greening their image. And I feel that we do come across clients and companies in general, that this is now part of their sustainability and green program. They've added PFAS in there. And there, I think the more they get recognition, and plaudits, or they win awards, all of that counts for a lot. And so I think there was one major client I spoke to, they actually have some kind of a point system for their green and sustainable programs, measuring the success, and the business value of that in terms of business reputation is a big one there. So I would say those two. And I think even things like sending them emails, that then they'll put in their annual reports, little quotes, I bought your product because of this. All of those things help.
So first I want to thank Ray for being here, because I've probably known you for a couple of years now, Ray. We've never actually met in person other than on Zoom or whatever. So it's so wonderful to have you and to hear your presentation. So this may be a question for Usha and Ray. One of the tools or levers that we didn't talk about is product disclosure, and how that can complement particularly certifications and labeling of products. So there's at least one state, the state of Maine, who now has mandatory product disclosure for products that contain PFAS, meaning that if your a brand or producer and you want to sell any product in that state that contains PFAS, you must disclose the presence of PFAS, and you must disclose within certain ranges how much PFAS is in that product. So this will be a mandatory requirement. There are other states that are looking at a similar approach. This is what Washington does for certain chemicals of concern in children's products. So I just wanted you to comment on product disclosure as another tool to sort of amplify what products contain PFAS at what levels, and, you know, to amplify how we, you know, can understand these certifications and product labeling in that circumstance.
Thanks for that question, Harry. And it's good to meet you in person as well, the perils of getting hired during a pandemic. So the way we tend to think about product verification and information disclosure in Washington state is actually that in an ideal world, we would have a trusted source of information that has already done a certain amount of this verification, like particularly with regards to chemical hazard, that we wouldn't need to ask companies for this information. What it would take to get to that point really would be some sort of, again, trusted verifier and trusted collector of that information with a really transparent method for what information they're getting from companies, what they're doing with it, how they're verifying it, to Usha's point. And then, you know, again, like some sort of idea that also it's updated frequently. I know in some of the circles I'm in, we've floated the beautiful hypothetical of an actual chemical registration that's global, where you have to get, you know, your chemicals cleared through OECD or something similar before you can use them anywhere globally. And provided that they had a really transparent method and it had a sufficient level of detail, then we really probably wouldn't need to ask companies to disclose information to us. And, you know, based on not in this program, but in other programs, we've worked with third-party verifiers that have really transparent processes in the past. We found that in some ways companies appreciate that because it means they don't have to submit their information multiple places. They can just sort of, we can use work that's already been done. So I guess in an ideal world, we wouldn't need to ask for this information. It would already be somewhere else and we could, you know, work with others to not have to ask companies to give us the same information multiple times.
I think I only have a couple practical things to add. One thing we notice is that if I, from a consulting firm, call up some manufacturer and ask whether there's PFAS in their products, they don't necessarily want to disclose anything to me. But when I call on behalf of a client who is one of their main purchasers and say, I need this information because they're trying to make a decision, then they're much more willing to disclose information, even though they may still not disclose all the information, but at least, you know, they'll disclose some information. So there are some tools within the world of business, I think, that if somebody is your main customer and they say, hey, I need to know this information, that people may provide that information. I think another thing, though, is lack of control on the part of some manufacturers. Like when I was looking at the labels for going PFAS free from REI and Target, for example, I noticed actually they said this applies to our branded products because they can only control, right, and have an active role in the products that carry their names, but they're also selling products made by others, and then they're not so willing to, you know, make those claims. And again, I think Target was going in the direction, I believe Home Depot also, they were going to ask for verification before they would sell somebody's products, but I don't actually know the status of like how far along they are in that process. So
maybe Mike knows the answer to that question.
Hey, how's it going? Yeah, my name is Mike Schaider. I'm with the Mind the Store campaign and Toxic Free Future. I just wanted to put a plug in for a couple of resources and tools that I think can help. Just on the last question, I think it's true that business to business disclosure is another element of a robust program that companies need to follow to evaluate ingredients in products. Just like businesses should be disclosing information on chemical ingredients to government agencies, whether it be here in Massachusetts or Washington or elsewhere. Another tool that brands and retailers can pursue beyond testing is actually requiring suppliers to disclose ingredients to them. And that's, I think, a lot easier to do for formulated products than it is for articles like food packaging. And that's a huge challenge in this space. So it's critical, but it's quite challenging. The tools I just wanted to give a plug for. One, we just today updated, we have a fact sheet on our website that has a nice summary of grocery store chains and fast food chains that have made public commitments to reduce and eliminate primarily added PFAS to food contact materials. We literally just updated that today. So if you're interested in getting a sense of what is the latest in terms of policy commitments for major brands and retailers to address PFAS in food contact materials, that is a fact sheet that we have on our website at saferchemicals.org, and literally just updated it today with information on recent commitments from companies like Burger King and Starbucks. The second plug I just wanted to make is we've also put together a written guide that kind of walks businesses through the steps of how do you go about developing and implementing a program to phase out and restrict PFAS in your supply chain. And it talks a lot about what things folks have talked about today, from third-party verification, disclosure, testing, training, et cetera. So that's just a free tool that we've put together on our website to help businesses understand how they can go about developing and implementing a program to restrict PFAS in food contact materials. So those are just two free resources we have on our website at saferchemicals.org. And then the last thing that I just wanted to say, which is a comment, is we've talked a lot about how governments can play an important role in advancing solutions through, regulatory bans, for example, like we see in Washington and New York and California. I think another important tool in the toolbox that states here in New England and the Northeast have is also around procurement and environmentally preferable purchasing. Certainly a lot of city and state governments buy a lot of food service ware. Undoubtedly there's PFAS in some of those products. So another way that government agencies can advance solutions to this is to leverage the purchasing power of cities and states to ask questions from suppliers. Does the food contact materials our state is buying, does it contain PFAS? Do suppliers meet the green screen standard for food service ware? So I think that's another important role that governments can play to advance solutions to this that I just wanted to highlight.
Thank you. And we're all pointing at Julia Wolf down there. Molly.
Great session. Loved it. My question's for Ray. And again, I share the experience of being here and actually meeting someone who I've met only online. So welcome to the East Coast. My question is also an observation. I was attending the session across the hall where we got to hear from DTSC and their alternatives analysis program. And in that program, the onus is on the business to ask themselves, okay, I have this toxic chemical in this priority product. What are my options for substituting? What are my alternatives? In this case, the question, and it's true also when the European Union does a restriction, the question is about, are there available safer products, right? So not, is it possible for an industry to reformulate, which is the question that's being asked in California, but can we issue this restriction because people can go on and find, similar safer products on the market? And so my question is, I think it's brilliant to go back a few years later and look at the assessment again, because I'm wondering if with that first assessment, did it send a signal that if there are safer options for paper plates, there are probably safer options for French fry cartons. You just haven't used it yet. I know I can't ask what's in the new report, but I'm just wondering if in a real analysis, a couple years later, that first alternatives assessment actually signaled to some of these product manufacturers to say, hey, if they can do it, we can do it. And the signals are everywhere that we have to get out of the business of using PFAS.
Thanks for bringing that up, Molly. I think that's a really good point. There's sort of two thoughts. One, I can share one small aspect of the second assessment because this was something we made publicly available, which is that one of the pieces of feedback we really heard about this first assessment was that we were way too rigid in, not way too rigid, but we were rigid in how we define types of food packaging. If you think about the numerous ways fast food restaurants serve French fries, I can tell you right now, like 3 of the types of food packaging that we identified could all be used to serve French fries. So one of the things, to your question a little bit, that we did look at was, just were we defining things so rigidly that we weren't thinking about the possibilities of, if it's possible to do this in one type of food packaging, is it actually already possible to do it in other types that we were thinking about? I think alongside that, I can't speak to how companies view this. A lot of things happened at the same time beyond what Washington was doing, right? California started to look at food packaging and then later passed a ban. New York passed a ban. There was the voluntary FDA phase out where, a number of the PFAS that were commonly used in food packaging aren't going to be on the market anymore in a few years. So it's really hard to say. But I think that's a really interesting question that you raise, and something that we might keep in mind as we sort of continue to have this sort of state-led alternatives assessment, where, as you raise, the question is not so much, is it theoretically possible to move away from these alternatives, but more like, is there already movement in the market that we can encourage by demonstrating that, there are these alternatives that are safer, feasible, and available. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thanks. And if you're interested in alternatives assessment, Molly's going to be talking about AFFF alternatives assessment tomorrow. Just another teaser.
Thanks. I wanted to take Dr. Schaider up on her invite to discuss a little bit more the intentional versus unintentional. And one of the things that really caught my attention in the Consumer Reports study was the packaging from Whole Foods. Whole Paycheck had, of course, agreed to put an end to the use of PFAS. And I believe a couple of their items came in just barely above the 20 standard from the Danish standard. And is that actually a functional use of PFAS at that level? Is that unintentional? Do we know? How should we begin thinking about that?
Yeah, those are all really good questions, and I'm not sure I have the answer to that. To be honest, I don't know where that 20 came from that the Danish were using in terms of a level of intentional addition. I did see one study that looked at adding different types of PFAS to paper, and you can look at, if you put a drop of oil or water on it, what the contact angle looks like. So if you're adding enough of it that it's really repelling the water, it changes the surface tension and it beads up more. And if it's not enough there, then it doesn't kind of bead up. And that level of how much you needed to add to get that, just like everything with PFAS, it depended on which compound you were talking about, and you had to add more of the short chain ones to have that same effect. So I think it's a really good question, and I don't know if there's different formulations, if that 20 is sort of a middle ground, and there could be, in one product that might signify an intentional addition, and in another it might be unintentional. I don't know if either of you have more to add to that.
I just wanted to mention one other point. So, when we talk about PFAS, particularly from a regulatory standpoint, I think most of the time we're talking about non-polymeric PFAS. But actually there are fluoropolymers too, right? They're commonly used. And how when we started with PFAS toxicity, all the focus was on long chain. Short chains were fine. Now we're saying short chains are not fine. So in the same way, now there are a few publications out there questioning whether polymeric PFAS and fluoropolymers, are they really low toxicity? Because all this time we were saying, well, we only have to worry about the non-polymeric. So I think that's something to keep tracking. And I don't know if that is something that, for example, if you did total organic fluorine or something, whether that would count in that unintentionally added or something that right now is not on our radar. But could be there eventually. So.
Very short. So when you looked at the alternatives assessment, were you considering at all compostability? And I know that's not a metric of the alternatives assessment in a traditional sense, but from a source separated organic material concern?
So we did not explicitly consider end of life and when we were thinking about alternatives, but this is something where, you know, we sort of again see this as where's the market at? And so we've been pretty upfront that, you know, we encourage people to consider the end of life of the alternatives that they are choosing to use. But that wasn't something we were asked to consider by the legislature. And so we didn't explicitly factor it in. But yeah, that being said, you know, we, again, because this is such a broad alternatives assessment, I wouldn't recommend that a company just superimpose this wholesale without thinking about their needs, or that an end user not think about their needs. And end of life of the products that you're using is definitely something I would encourage an individual consumer or business to think very carefully about when implementing this assessment.
That's great. And we are out of time, but what a tremendous session. Thank you very much.